On the last Wednesday of November, I was in my office downstairs and I was preparing for the evening Bible study that would start in an hour or two. And I got a call from the Jewish general. And it was a doctor in the birthing center. There is a single mom that we have been helping out, that we have been connecting with and trying to support in what had been a difficult pregnancy for her. And the doctor told me that they had been a problem, that the baby had no heart rate, and that she had just been induced, and that she'd asked whether I would come and pray. And so I made my way to the Jewish General. I've been just about to every place in the Jewish General, but I have never been in the birthing center, and I've never been in the birthing room. And I walked in with my stole and my clerical collar, surrounded by nurses and the doctor and the doula and the mum on the bed. And I led in prayer, and I was glad the doctors stepped aside and bowed their heads as I prayed and asked for the Lord's strength at whatever was going to come that evening. I made my way back here, led Bible study, and did a little bit of paperwork, and at about 11:30, quarter to 12, the call that I had been dreading came. The baby had been born and was stillborn, full term and stillborn. I went over to the hospital, and I sat in the room with the mom holding this little baby, and we wept, and we prayed together. And when the moment came when the body needed to make its way down to the morgue downstairs, the mom looked at me and said, "I don't want the nurses to do this. I want you to take Nehemiah down and to tell me that he's safe." And as I walked out of the room holding little Nehemiah, little package in my arms, I made my way to the nurse's station. There's a protocol that needs to be followed in these cases, and so I needed the head nurse to come with me to clean the body and to prepare it and just to sign off on some paperwork. And as we were about to do that, there was a code blue on the floor, and all the nurses left. And I was left at the nurse's station holding Nehemiah. And it was about 45 minutes or an hour, and grandfather habits kicked in. I started to rock. You're holding a baby and you just naturally rock, and then I began to sing the little Nehemiah. And when the nurses and the orderlies came back to the station from the code blue and they realized what I was doing, they began to cry and I began to cry, and it was a hard evening. These are some of the things that they don't teach you in seminary. And it is these moments where you wonder just how far your faith goes. It is these moments as a pastor that you wish you had better skills than you have. It's at these moments as a pastor that you wish you had miraculous power in prayer to do the impossible. We live in a broken world. It wasn't made this way. The beautiful world that our Creator made has been spoiled and plunged into chaos because of our waywardness. Over these last few weeks in Luke chapter 8, we have been seeing some of the worst that evil has done to our world caused by sin. And fortunately, the Lord Jesus was there. With authority over the created order, he spoke to the waves and winds and calmed the chaos of nature. Last week, with authority over the forces of evil that have ruined our world, he commanded the evil spirits away. But this morning comes the ultimate test: the severe illness and the death of a child. At these moments of darkness, when the ravages of sin and evil in our world are heartbreaking, it is at these moments that we feel the most helpless and that we cry out to God. There are several people in our text today in Luke who find themselves in just such a low point, including two parents who have lost a young child. This morning we read from Luke 8, beginning at verse 40. Jesus left the territory of the Gerasenes last week. He was unwelcome there. He did one miracle, and they asked him to leave. And in contrast, he gets on the boat. He gets back closer to home near the city of Capernaum on the shore. And there the crowds want him. They want to hear from him, and they want to see him. Luke chapter 8, and starting at Luke at verse 40, if you're following along at home. Now, when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. And there came a man named Jairus, who was a ruler of the synagogue. And falling at Jesus' feet, he implored him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she was dying. As Jesus went, the people pressed around him, and there was a woman who'd had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and though she'd spent all her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone. She came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment, and immediately her discharge of blood ceased. And Jesus said, "Who was it that touched me?" When all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowd surround you and are pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out from me." And when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling and falling down before him, declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." While he was still speaking, someone from the ruler's house came and said, "Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher anymore." But Jesus, on hearing this, answered him, "Do not fear, only believe, and she will be well." And when he came to the house, he allowed no one to enter with him except Peter and John and James and the father and mother of the child. And all were weeping and mourning for her. And he said, "Do not weep, for she's not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But taking her by the hand, he called, saying, "Child, arise." And her spirit returned, and she got up at once. And he directed that something should be given her to eat. And her parents were amazed, and he charged them to tell no one what had happened. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We have this morning two stories interwoven. And I have to tell you that I came very, very close to separating the two stories and dealing with one this week and the other one next week. You know your pastor, you know that I tend to preach a little too long, and I thought if I've got two stories to deal with, there's no way I can do this in time for you to get home for lunch. So this is what we'll do. I'll do story number one, I'll send you home for lunch, then you'll come back and we'll do, no, I'm teasing. The two stories belong together. In fact, interestingly, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell the two stories, and all of them intertwine them together this way. We think this is the way it happened. First, there's Jairus, a very powerful man who comes to Jesus. The text tells us that he's a ruler of the synagogue. He is a leader in the community. He's not a religious official. The position of ruler of the synagogue was not given to a scribe or to a Pharisee or to someone who'd done theological studies. It was a position of honor that was really bought more than earned, usually through their money, through their philanthropy, through their influence in the community. There's an individual who would be appointed as ruler of the synagogue. It's sort of like a glorified clerk of session, chair of the board of managers, all rolled into one. This is the guy who called the shots in the local synagogue. It was a lay position. And it's often mentioned in the first century. Josephus talks about several rulers of synagogues. We've got documents dating from this time period that talk about who the rulers of the synagogues in the local communities would be. He had a lot of responsibilities. He would schedule the worship. He would arrange the preachers. He would select the readings. He would organize the liturgy. He'd make sure that the choir had their pieces together. And he would actually oversee the care of the building. He didn't do the work himself, but he would have had a couple of volunteers. If the synagogue was large enough, there would have been a hired janitor, and he reported to the ruler of the synagogue. Interestingly, he's the one who had to procure the scrolls. If he decided that next month we were going to do a series of preaching series in the synagogue on Isaiah, he's the one who would have to go and find a scroll of the book of Isaiah because they didn't have a complete Bible in every synagogue. And so, in a very responsible position. In a devout Jewish community, in a devout Jewish town like Capernaum, the leader of the synagogue is at the top of the social order. He's wealthy, he's respected, he lives in a nice area of town, in a nice house. He has many servants. People kind of bow when he walks by. When he walks down the street, the crowd opens and parts to let him by. He's listened to, and he's the one to whom people normally bow. Even now, as he approaches Jesus with a problem, he's accompanied by a crowd. He has an entourage. There's a large retinue. There would have been some of his family members, some of his acquaintances, some of his servants, maybe a couple of bodyguards. And there's still more people waiting back at home. He's got a large household. But on this day, probably, perhaps for the first time in his life, He's the one doing the bowing. Jairus is in a position of powerlessness and desperation, depending completely on somebody else. Now, we don't know if, like the scribes and the Pharisees, he would have disliked Jesus, but at the very least, Jesus had a reputation, and Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue, had to know that it was pretty bad for his reputation to have anything to do with Jesus, never mind inviting him back to his house, never mind coming and bowing before him like he does. But none of this matters to him on this day, because he has one little precious girl, and she's sick. She's not just sick, she's dying. I doubt that he had let things get to this point without trying other things. I'm sure he tried the doctors in town. I'm sure he tried praying at the synagogue. I'm sure he tried everything that he knew to do. So when he comes and asks Jesus to come to his house, when he falls at his feet and implores him, this is his last hope. Now, there's something I find interesting about Jairus. Jairus has to handle this one with more humility than he ever has. He's taking now his turn to come before somebody else and to plead for help, as many others had done to him in the past. But Jairus basically handles this the same way he's handled other problems in the past. When you're rich and powerful and in control in the community, when you have a problem, you go find somebody who can fix it. You tell them to come to your house and fix it. That's the way you do it. You give orders. And so that's all Jairus knows how to do. He goes to see Jesus. He says, I have a problem. I need you. You're coming to my house, and you're going to fix my problem. Presuming that Jesus will go out of his way and follow him to his house. And even that they will follow quickly back to your house because this is urgent. After all, you're the ruler of the synagogue. I find it interesting that the centurion, when he comes to Jesus and his servant is ill far away in his house, he says, I'm not even worthy of you to make the trip to come back to my house. Just say the word and he'll be healed at a distance. Lazarus' sisters send for Jesus and ask Jesus to come, but they don't insist come right away. And it's a little different because Lazarus and Mary and Martha are friends. Everybody else who comes to Jesus for healing finds their way to Jesus somehow. We're even told the story of 4 friends who have a paralytic buddy back home, and even they don't come to see Jesus and say, hey, we've got a friend back home, he's a paralytic and he can't walk. Would you come back with us to his house? Even they bring the paralytic and they carry him through the crowd and they go to the roof and they open the roof and they lower him down. Of all the gospel stories, Jairus is the only one who has the audacity and the affront and the gall and the nerve to come see Jesus, interrupt the teaching session, pull him out of the crowd and say, you're coming with me to my house now. But Jesus graciously doesn't push back, doesn't reply, doesn't kick up a fuss, doesn't stop and take time to tell him a parable. He turns, stops what he's doing, and follows Jairus. Now, Jairus is the ruler of the synagogue in Capernaum. Jesus is back in his hometown. They're not out in the desert anymore where the wild demon-possessed man was. They're in this village. And so as Jesus follows Jairus back to his house, they're winding through the narrow streets of this little town of Capernaum. At one point, we think Capernaum may have had as many as 700 or 800 residents. Not a big town, but a lot of little narrow winding streets. It's not DeCary Boulevard. It's like the little streets back around here. And as they're walking and making their way slowly through the narrow streets, it would have taken some time to get there. Knowing Jesus, I find it hard to believe that they didn't have some conversation on the way. I've often wondered what they talked about. Jairus knew the Old Testament scriptures a little bit because he was in charge of the scrolls. He's the one who would find the scroll for Isaiah or Jeremiah or Genesis or the Psalms for the reading every Sabbath. I wonder whether Jesus would have engaged him about the Old Testament. I wonder whether Jesus would have said, so Jairus, what scripture scroll did you bring in for the service this coming Sabbath? I wonder if they had that conversation. Or more likely, I wonder whether the very nervous Jairus is the one who did the talking, telling Jesus about his sick little girl who's getting sicker by the minute, I wonder if Jairus tells Jesus about everything they've tried. Wonder whether Jairus tells Jesus, my wife back home is beside herself with chagrin and with worry and with concern. She's our only little girl, and she's sick, and it's getting worse, and her fever is rising, and we don't know what's going on. And I think Jesus probably did more listening than talking on the way back to Jairus' house. And as they progress, as they make their way, the crowd is growing a little larger. Something's going to happen. Jesus is going with Jairus. His little girl is sick. He's going to do a healing, and the crowds love the healing. You can just imagine in the bottleneck of these little streets, the crowd is moving forward, and it's getting larger and larger, and they're slowly making their way, and people are pushing in around him. The expression is interesting. The word they used to say that the crowd was pressing in around him, the Greek word there is only used in one other place in Luke 8:14, when Jesus tells the story of the wheat that grows and the thorns, they cluster around the wheat and they choke the grain of wheat. So it's the same word that's used there. So there's a crowd and there's a bottleneck. They can barely move through the narrow streets because everybody's pushing up against each other. The story began with important Mr. Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue, but in the crowd, there's a nobody. There's an invisible woman. The text never even tells us her name. We don't know anything else about her except what happens here. And furtively, discreetly, lost in the crowd, she tries to make her way. She has an embarrassing problem. She has a flow of blood, and it's a hemorrhage. And the text is discreet about the way it describes, but Luke, the physician, gives us enough information that we know where she's bleeding from. And bleeding from there continuously would have made you ceremoniously unclean. Josephus, who writes at the time of Christ, tells us explicitly that the temple was off limits to women while they were menstruating during the month. So her blood flow of this, she would never have been able to go into the temple ever because of this blood flow. She lives in distance and isolation. She's continually ceremonially impure. Anybody who touches her is ceremonially impure. Anybody who shares a meal with her is ceremoniously impure. Anybody who shares a home with her is ceremonially impure. Jairus comes with his entourage and his family and his servants. She comes alone. She has no family. She has no entourage, no one else to plead her case. Now imagine the daily physical weakness. She's bleeding continually every day. Don't even want to guess at how low her iron count was. And it likely would have been a challenge for her just to mount up the physical strength to get out of the house, to get dressed, to go and find Jesus. And then when she gets there, she's got to work her way through the crowd. And then the crowd is moving. She has to keep pace with the crowd. And Jairus is anxious because his daughter's sick. And I'm sure that Jairus wasn't sauntering along. I'm sure that as they got closer and closer to Jairus' house, that Jairus is moving faster and faster. And the crowd is moving faster. And she can barely keep up with the crowd. The other gospel writers give us a little more background. Luke tells us that she has spent all she had on physicians, and none of them were able to help her. Now, it's already good that Luke, who's a physician himself, he's a little kinder about the doctors. All he says is that the doctors tried their best. You know, they did everything they could, but they couldn't quite do it. Luke still tells us that didn't stop them from presenting their bill at the end of the day. Yeah, I'm sorry, I couldn't help you, but here's my bill. For medical services not rendered, good luck. Here's a colleague you might want to see, but here's my bill. She'd spent everything she had on doctors who couldn't help her. Mark is a little less kind. Mark is not a doctor. Mark says they couldn't help her, they took all the money she had, and in fact, they'd done her harm. She was worse off when she left them than when she went to see the doctor. I'm thinking the doctors had not read the Hippocratic Oath. How does it go? First, do no harm. Let me read you about the kinds of things that the Talmud recommended as treatment for a woman who had this kind of hemorrhage. Talmud says, take the gum of Alexandria, the weight of a small silver coin, an alum about the same weight, and of crocus plant about the same weight. Let them be crushed and mixed together and given in wine to the woman who has the issue of blood. Sounds appetizing. If this does not benefit, take 3 pints of Persian onions, boil them in wine, and give her to drink. And as she drinks, say, arise from thy flux. If that doesn't cure her, set her in a place where two ways meet, let her hold a cup of wine in her right hand, and let some come on behind her and frighten her and say, "Arise from thy flux." Apparently, they thought the cure for hemorrhage was similar to the cure for hiccups, I guess. I don't know. The feeling was that infertility and this kind of feminine blood loss was probably linked to some kind of spiritual issue. If you were infertile, it was because the Lord had closed your womb. If you had a blood flow that wouldn't stop, there was something wrong with you spiritually. And they were squeamish about dealing with issues that were related to feminine issues. It is little wonder that unlike Jairus, this poor woman opts for the discreet approach when she comes to Jesus. The other Gospels tell us what she reasoned ahead of time in her mind. She'd heard a little bit about Jesus and about his power, and she thought all she needed to do was to touch his garment, to touch the fringe of his garment. Now, unfortunately, the English translations are a little confusing here. Some of them use the word hem, and you've probably heard the story that way, that as she came, she figured she would touch the hem of his garment. Now, it would have been hard for her to touch the bottom of Jesus' coat. He's got a robe, a long robe. She'd had to bow down, and that's not something you could easily do in the crowd. Actually, what she was reaching for was the fringe of his garment. I borrowed one of Debbie's shawls here that has a fringe on it. Apparently she finds my office cold, so when she comes to visit me, she has to throw a shawl on. I just work with a sweater on. But the outer garment that they wore was thrown on, and it was half length, and it would just sit over like this. And when they were cold, because they're all right-handed, as all decent people were in those days, you would flip the garment over your left side like this, and the garment with the fringe would hang right there about 1.5 feet down beyond your shoulder, the fringe of the garment. There was rumor and there was superstition that a Jewish rabbi, that a man of spiritual insight, that the fringe, the little tassels on the edge of his outer garment were magical. It was a superstition. She'd heard that there was this superstition about the rabbis, and she thought surely for Jesus that would be the case. And so she comes behind him in the crowd. She's not reaching for the hem. There's a little ceremonial fringe. It would have hung about halfway down his back. And in the crowd she figures, maybe I can just get close enough to just kind of touch it. And this is what she reaches for. Whoops. Thank you, honey. And as soon as she touches the fringe of Jesus' garment, she feels it. Something happened. Now, I'll tell you one of the things that struck me about this. Immediately when the blood flow stopped, she knew it had stopped. And when I read that, I thought, for heaven's sake, how heavy must the flow have been? Can you imagine? She felt that it stopped. Imagine how bad this hemorrhage was. Now, I don't think she backed away. I think she touched, she stopped, she felt she was healed, and I think she stopped moving. And the crowd just kept kind of moving around her. And Jesus stops, turns around, he looks at the crowd behind him, and he says, "Who touched me?" Try this in a crowded elevator one day. You know when you're on the green line to the metro going to work at 8:30 on Monday morning, and there's like 2,000 people in the metro car, and you can't see your feet? And somebody's trying to get into your briefcase, you know, when you're packed like this. Try this. Just, "Who touched me?" Try. See how people respond. Peter says, "Are you out of your mind? Who touched you?" Look at the crowd. But he knew somebody had touched him, and the power flowed out from him. Parenthetically, it makes me wonder, and that's a question for another day. I wonder what it felt like physically for Jesus when he healed somebody. Apparently, he felt the power flowing out of him. There's moments where we're told that Jesus very humanly, at the end of the day, was exhausted after a day of healing. And I don't know if this is what he felt like every time he healed somebody, but he felt this power going through him. Now, Jesus doesn't ask because he doesn't know who she is. He could have picked the woman out of the crowd. He could have turned, looked at her and said, "You, come here." That's not what Jesus wants. He wants her to identify herself. There's a powerful phrase in verse 47. The woman saw that she wasn't hidden. In the Greek, the sense is that she wasn't hidden anymore. And it makes an interesting comment about this woman. She'd been invisible for the last 12 years. For the last 12 years, isolated, desperate, alone, ceremonially unclean, ignored by everybody. She doesn't even have a name. Suddenly, she's hidden no more. Interesting thought. She saw she wasn't hidden anymore. Now, when Jesus asked this, she's very cautious because there have been other moments as she's ceremonially unclean. She's not supposed to touch anybody. I'm sure there must have been other moments where she accidentally touched somebody and the person got upset and said, "Why are you touching me? Get away from me." And as Jesus asked this question, she's not sure. Is he angry? Is he upset? Is he going to yell at me for touching him because I'm ceremoniously unclean? And at first glance, it almost seems cruel of Jesus to single her out. I've been here long enough that I know a lot of you. And I know those of you in the congregation who are very happily wallflowers. You're quiet, you're discreet, you're introverts. Most other people in the congregation have never heard the sound of your voice, have no idea what your voice sounds like when you sing because you're quiet, you're calm, you're politely, you're here, you don't make a noise, and that's just the way you like it. Thank you very much. You don't want any attention paid to you. You come in discreetly, you worship, you leave discreetly, and you're very happy that way. And those of you who are like that, you read what Jesus does to this woman and you think, oh, no. It's going to single me out. Now, when you look at Jesus' miracles, both in Luke and the other Gospels, no two of them are exactly alike. Every miracle he does is slightly different, and there's a reason why he does what he does differently in every miracle. He heals 10 lepers. He heals them at a distance. They yell to him, he yells back, and they do this yelling at a distance. When a leper comes who's alone, he comes and he gives them a hug. At one point, I like this one, really to make a point, there's somebody who comes, he's a blind man, he comes to Jesus on the Sabbath to be healed, and the scribes and the Pharisees say, "Why do you come to be healed on the Sabbath? You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. Don't make Jesus heal you on the Sabbath. It's not right to work on the Sabbath." And just to press the point, I love what Jesus does. He could have spoken and given the man's eyesight back without doing anything, but on this day, he chooses to spit on the ground and to make mud. You know why he does that? Because the Torah described making mud as work that was disallowed on the Sabbath. So Jesus looks at the scribes and the Pharisees and said, "You're upset at me because I'm working and healing on the Sabbath? Watch this, I'm about to make mud." And he makes mud, he chooses intentionally to heal the man by making mud on the Sabbath because he's making a point. In each one of the miracles, every response he has to somebody who needs his help in healing, Jesus chooses to do it differently because there's a point to be made. And so this poor, discreet, quiet woman, he calls her out of the crowd, calls her out of her comfort zone, and he makes her say what happened to her. He makes her say it. I had a hemorrhage. I was bleeding for 12 years. Pardon me? He makes her say it. He makes her tell the crowd what had happened. There's 3 reasons why Jesus does this. First, he gets her to step out of the crowd, to identify herself, and to explain what had happened to her, because he wanted to be very clear to her and to everyone watching and to the whole community that she was clean, that she was healed, that she was ceremonially clean, that they could touch her now, that she could go to the synagogue, that she could go to the temple, because this is the town where she lives. This is the whole town who thinks, that's the woman we can't touch. That's the woman who can't come to the synagogue. That's the woman who's not allowed at the temple. That's the woman who can't come to the market. That's the woman we can't share a meal with. That's the woman who can't come to our house. So Jesus wants the whole town to know she's okay, she's clean, she's healed. You can welcome her back into community. And the only way for Jesus to do that was to make the announcement, look, she's okay. The second reason that she does this is that after years of isolation and denigration, after years of put downs and being glanced at askance, after years of being marginalized and untouched, Jesus wants to speak words of affirmation into her life, into her heart, and into her mind. And so he calls her out of the crowd, and she collapses trembling at his feet, and she tells her story. And then he looks at her, and he speaks words that nobody has spoken to her in a very, very long time. Did you get what he called her? He looked at her, and he said, daughter. It is the only time anywhere in the Gospels that Jesus calls anybody daughter, son, anything like this. And it's particularly pointed because it comes in the middle of the story of the healing of Jairus' daughter. I confess there's moments when I have a hard time with Jesus healing Jairus' daughter. Because Jairus' daughter is the little rich girl. She's the one who has all the fashion accessories, the tennis lessons, the dance lessons, and the violin lessons. She's the one who gets an iPad and a pony for her birthday every year. She's the best dressed little girl at school. She's the one who has the fancy stuff in her lunches. And her father is the wealthy, happening man in town, and there's nothing he denies to his precious little girl. And on this day when she isn't well, she's getting worse in fact, and dozens of servants in the whole town is worried and concerned for her. The whole town is a mess because of Jairus' daughter who's sick. And in contrast, this poor woman, nobody even knows her name. And so pointedly, so that she knows that she is as precious as Jairus' little girl, he looks at this woman who had been invisible, and he says, daughter, my little girl, my precious, precious little girl. But there's a third reason why Jesus calls her out in public. We're not quite sure who she thought Jesus was. She seemed to have come to him because she's bought into the superstition that all she needs to do is touch the magical fringe of his garment and she'll be healed. And he's not quite sure what she's reasoning. So Jesus wants to make it clear what has made her well. He looks at her and he says, daughter, it's not the magical fringe on my garment that made you well. It's not some superstitious incantation. It's not some weird, unknown, mystical power. Daughter, your faith in me has made you well. It has nothing to do with the fringe of my garment. It has nothing to do with a magical spell or incantation. Your faith in who I am has made you well. And after this dramatic, life-changing encounter, Jesus does something interesting. When you would meet a friend, and when you said goodbye, instead of just saying goodbye in Hebrew, you know what you would say. You would say, shalom, go in peace. Now, we say goodbye very, casually, and they would say shalom, go in peace, very casually. I find it interesting on this day. He sends her off with the usual greeting, but he's just healed her. He's called her daughter. And when he says, go in peace, it's the first time in a very, very long time that she's actually going in peace. Now, while all this is unfolding, there's been this interruption. And I'm trying to picture Jairus standing there. You remember Jairus, right? Because Jairus is there, and I don't know if Jairus has his arms crossed. I don't know if he's tapping his feet. I don't know if he's looking at his watch, or if he's got a sundial and he's going, Jesus, my daughter, she's done. Apparently, he waits patiently, doesn't say anything. We've got no words recorded. Time is of the essence. I remember when Mary and Martha sent Jesus to tell them that their brother Lazarus is sick, and Jesus waits another 4 days. By the time he gets there, Lazarus is dead. And when Jesus gets there, it's funny, both sisters greet him the same way. Same words, but slightly different tone of voice. Martha has her hand on her shoulder. She comes to see Jesus. She looks him in the face, and she said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Martha wants to know, where the heck were you? Why weren't you here? When Mary comes later, she says the same words, except she's crying and she's on her knees before Jesus, and she's weeping, but she says the same words. If only you had been here, my brother would. I wonder what Jairus is thinking. I wonder what Jairus' wife is thinking back home. I wonder what kind of emotions are going through his heart. And just as this wraps up, just as Jesus has finished speaking to this woman, there comes a servant from the house, and he's coming with speed, but there's no bounce in his step. I don't know if you've ever been at the hospital when somebody's going into surgery and you're waiting for the news for the doctor. And you know at that moment when your husband or your friend or your child or your mother's in surgery and you're waiting in the waiting room and the doctor comes out and pulls the mask down and he's coming out of the surgery. And you know what you do. We all do it. You check to see what the doctor's face looked like. Is he smiling? Does he have a bounce in his step? Or is he looking at his feet when he walks to you? And when the servant comes, there's no bounce in his step. There's no smile. Don't worry. Too late. The master go. The child is dead. Don't fear, Jesus says. Just believe, and she will be made well. I don't know if you've ever been in one circumstances where the circumstances seem impossible. You're finished. You're done. All hope is gone. Nothing left to hang on to. This man had just seen that Jesus could heal this woman with this loss of blood, but he'd never seen Jesus raise someone from the dead. I don't know if he'd heard what Jesus had done to the son of the widow from Nain just a couple chapters earlier, but Jesus says, let's go. Gets to the house, brings Peter and James and John in with him. Very different, isn't it? With the woman with the loss of blood, he makes her blurt it out in public. He wants everybody to know. Why? Because it's important for the whole town to know that she's well, that she's okay, that she's restored, that she's ceremonially clean. With this little girl, he takes a very, very different approach. And there's a reason. Imagine if you're lying dead in your bedroom, and suddenly you wake up, and there's 800 people with you in your bedroom. You know. The other thing Jesus is worried about here in Quebec many, many years ago, the first time quintuplets were born here in North America, it was the Dion sisters. There were 5 little girls born in northern Ontario. And the media circus that was made of that family was horrible. And the 3 surviving sisters still today talk about how horrible it was. The photographers were there was cameras outside their house all the time. They made like a it was a Dion quintuplets play park. It was like a Disney World around their house because everybody wanted to see the 5 little identical girls. It was horrible. And I think Jesus is trying to avoid them this, trying to spare them this publicity. So he goes into the room. There's just Peter, James, and John with him. And some of the people read the story and say, well, Jesus didn't really raise her from the dead. He said she was just asleep and she was kind of like in a coma, but she was still there. And Jesus came and he just roused her, and he sort of woke her up. She wasn't really dead. I'm sorry. They'd called the mourners. The professional mourners were there. They'd called the undertaker. The undertaker and the mourners, they knew when somebody was dead. And they arrive, and in fact, after Jesus has raised her, the text says, her spirit returned. Her spirit had left her. She was dead. And the resurrection, the resuscitation was immediate. The text says he spoke to her. He took the child by the hand. He said, come, rise. Immediately she got up, and she started moving around. And then he gives her something to eat. You remember on the seashore, the day after his resurrection, when Jesus meets the disciples, they're not sure if he's a ghost, if it's an apparition, if they're dreaming this. So he says, give me something to eat. And he gives them something to eat, and eating something proved that he was bodily, physically risen from the dead. Jesus restores this little girl to them. The parents' reaction uses a peculiar word that only appears a few times in the New Testament. They were amazed. They're startled. They couldn't believe it. They went from mourning to joy. In fact, the word they use for the amazement and the joy of the parents, occasionally it's used for somebody who's out of their mind. In Mark 4, at one point, Jesus' brothers and sisters, they think he's gone crazy. They think they can't figure out what's going on with him. He's preaching and like, what's going on with their brother, And they come to take him by force because they think he's out of his mind. It's the same word in the Greek that's used here for the parents. They are so overjoyed, they're out of their mind with joy. Because the little girl was dead, and she's back. I think it's the only time that the local undertaker and the mourners had their contract canceled. I work with Canyon Federally, I work with Mount Royal, I work with a lot of the cemeteries, and I've never heard of this happen before. Family called the undertaker and say, yeah, our father died, and then called 2 days. Oh, never mind, it's okay, he's fine. Take the casket back, we don't need you. Again and again, Jesus does this. He turns a house of mourning into a place of joy. In Luke chapter 8, we've learned that the power that Jesus has is greater than the forces of the created world when it goes into chaos. He can calm the winds and the storm and the seas. He is more powerful than any illness. He's more powerful than the evil spirits and the havoc they wreak on this world. But the greatest problem in our world, the greatest after effect of our sin is death. And Jesus conquers even death. On Wednesday this week, we will lay our precious sister Indra to rest in the sure and certain hope of the resurrection to eternal life through our Lord Jesus Christ. Death may well have claimed her body for now, but this is only temporary. The day will come where she will be risen again to new life. But is this just wistful thinking? Does Jesus really have this kind of power? Or are these just stories we tell ourselves to make ourselves feel good? 1 Corinthians 15, that we'll read together on Wednesday afternoon, says, but in fact, Christ has been risen from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For he must reign until he has put all of his enemies under his feet. The chaos of the wind and the storm and the seas, the chaos of illness, the chaos of the evil spirits brought on that man we saw last week. But the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Whether you're the beloved daughter of somebody rich and important, or whether you're a lonely, isolated person, and it's been a long time since anybody's called you a daughter, the promise of restoration and new life is for you. Like that little newborn child that I cuddled in my arms in the birthing center that the scriptures tell us has slipped into the presence of God. Like our sister Indra, who is not dead, who is very much alive. She's just changed her address. All those who belong to Christ will one day be raised with him to new life. I wonder this morning whether you will be among them. I wonder whether he will look to you one day and say, son, daughter, come away, rise to eternal glory. Amen. Father, we are grateful that this world that you created, that has been spoiled and tainted and broken by sin, we are grateful that it will be restored, renewed, and made new. We are grateful that one day these broken, frail, fragile, perishable, mortal human bodies will be transformed, will be changed. We will share your glory and will slip with you into eternity. We are grateful that our sister Indra has gone ahead of us, and we look forward to being reuniting with her one day. Father, this is our faith. We are grateful this morning for this reminder in the story that this is your power, that the final enemy that you conquer is death. Thank you for new life. Thank you for new life in the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.